Chapter 14 of Half-Life by Zhang Ailing. Manzin was admitted to the hospital because of dystocia. The Zhu family originally invited an obstetrician to deliver the baby at home. She was a female doctor they knew well, and she often played cards with Manlu. She has seen a lot and is not surprised at all, so Manlu thinks she can be trusted. Her medical skills were not very good, but she encountered difficult labor. She advocated sending her to the hospital, but the Zhu family kept waiting and were worried about letting Manzin walk out of the door. It was only at the last moment that they hurriedly sent her to a hospital by car. It was Manlu who accompanied her. Of course, Manlu wanted to stay in the first-class ward and isolate her from the outside world as much as possible. However, it happened that both the first and second-class wards were full, and she was afraid of delaying time if she moved to another hospital, so she had to stay in the third-class ward. Manzin had already fallen into a coma when she left Zhu's house. But when the car door slammed, the car slowly drove out, and the large iron gate of the garden opened, she suddenly felt clear. She finally came out. Even if you die, you must die outside. She hated that house so much that she would never go back again, except in a nightmare. She knew she would dream about it, no matter how old she lived. She could never forget the house and garden like a magical palace. She would return there again and again in her terrifying dreams. She gave birth to a boy in the hospital who weighed only 5 pounds. She thought he would not survive. The night shift nurse brought the child to her to feed her, and she looked at his red face under the dim yellow light. When the child was not born, she felt hatred for him more than anything else, even though she knew the child was innocent. Even now, with the child here, in her arms, she felt a slight shiver of disgust in her surprise. Does he look like, in fact, the newborn baby looked like no one, just like a red and skinned kitten. But Manzin seemed to find something suspicious on his face, which made her suspect that he looked a bit like Zhu Hongkai. It doesn't look like her at all. Some people also say that if the mother often misses someone when the child is pregnant, the child will look like that person in the future. Does it look like Shizhen? I really can't tell. Thinking of Shizhen, she immediately felt confused. When the Zhu family was spending their years in confinement, she was eager to meet him. When they met, she wanted to tell him everything, only he could comfort her. She never seemed to have thought that she already had a child with someone else. Would he treat her differently? That's human nature, right? But she idealized him, and she believed that he could only love her more because of all the hardships she had suffered. Fortunately, she had such an absolutely trustworthy person in her pain. She could always think of him in her mind. That was her only comfort. But now, she was about to regain her freedom, and she might be able to meet him soon, but she started to worry again. If he is in Shanghai, and happens to visit a friend in this hospital and sees her while walking through this room, that's great. He can rescue her right away, but if he happens to see this nursing child cuddling, how did he feel being around her? It's really embarrassing to think about it for him. She looked at the child, who was just sucking the milk with all his heart, as if he wanted to drink all of her. She had to try to leave the hospital quickly, maybe tomorrow, but she couldn't take her child with her. Her own future is uncertain, and she doesn't know what she will be like after she goes out. Don't worry about leaving the child to her sister. Her sister won't treat him badly. Haven't you always wanted a son? But the child was so thin that she believed he would die. She suddenly leaned down and kissed him passionately. She felt that their mother and son had met in a hurry on the border between life and death, and were about to be separated. However, for the time being, they were the closest people in the world. When the nurse came to take the child away, she asked the nurse for a glass of water. She had already said this the last time she came to measure the heat, and now she has said it again, but she has never brought it. She was really thirsty, so she had to shout loudly, "Miss Zhang, Miss Zhang." However, she woke up a pregnant woman in the bed next to her. She heard the man coughing. There was a white cloth screen between their two beds. They once talked across the screen, and the woman asked Manzin if it was her first child, a boy or a girl. She herself also gave birth to a boy, born on the same day as Manzin's child, only less than an hour apart. This woman's voice sounds very young, but she is already a mother of 4 children. Her husband's surname is Kai, and her name is Jin Fang. The couple spend their days setting up an egg stall in a small market. That night, Manson heard her coughing and asked, "Miss Kai, did it wake you up?" Kai Jinfeng said, "It's okay, the nurses here are terrible. Asking them to do something is like a beggar, Miss." I screamed loudly. "I'm really hurt, thinking about it. I can't bear the anger of my mother-in-law and my parents-in-law, so I came here to be angry with them." Kai Jinfeng turned over and said again, "Mrs. Chu, your sister-in-law didn't come to see you today." Manson was confused for a moment. Who was Mrs. Chu and who was sister-in-law? Then she suddenly remembered Manlu when she was sent to the hospital. She was probably registered as Mrs. Chu Hong Kai. Manlu came to visit her every day a few days ago. Everyone in the hospital knew that her surname was Shu, and they thought she was from Manson's mother-in-law's family. Seeing that Manson was speechless, Jin Feng asked again, "Is she your sister-in-law?" Manson could only agree vaguely. Jin Feng asked again, "Is your husband not in Shanghai?" Manson said her again, but felt very sad in her heart. It was late at night, and except for the two of them, everyone in the room was fast asleep. Outside the window is a dark sky, with a white cross embedded in the white painted window lattice. Under the dim light, Manson told Kai Jinfeng everything about her experiences. She had never met Jinfeng until now, but she intuitively felt that he was an enthusiastic person and she really needed help. She originally wanted to tell the doctor here as soon as she got the chance, and she asked to be discharged early without waiting for her family members to pick her up. Or tell the nurses to tell them. That's the same thing. But the doctors and nurses here obviously don't take the patients in the third-class ward seriously. Who wants to care about your family disputes? And what happened to her is so bizarre. Can people believe her? What if Manlo insists that she is mentally ill and takes her back while her body has not yet recovered and has no strength to struggle? Although there are many people in the hospital who has time to mind such noisy matters, she looked a bit like a psychopath herself. Her hair was very long and tangled on her shoulders. There was no mirror here, so she couldn't see her face, but she could see that her hands were now so pale. And her wrists were so pale. He was as thin as a stick, with a snail bone sticking up high. As long as her feet were a little stronger and she could stand on the ground, she quietly slipped out by herself. But now she felt dizzy even when she sat up, and she just hated her body for not living up to her expectations. She discussed with Jin Feng and wanted to ask Jin Feng's husband to send a letter to her home and ask her mother to pick her up immediately. In fact, she also felt that this method was not very appropriate. She still didn't know what her mother's attitude was. She had probably been bribed by her sister. Otherwise, why didn't she try to rescue her even after she had lost her freedom for almost a year? This was what hurt her the most. She didn't expect her own mother to treat her like this, but not as much as a stranger like Kai Jinfeng. Jin Feng was extremely angry, saying that her sisters and brother-in-law were simply inhuman, and said, "Drag them to the patrol room." Manson said hurriedly, "Be gentle." Jin Feng fell silent and listened to other patients. Still sleeping soundlessly, in the huge room, I could only hear the occasional slight click sound of the bamboo needle of the nurse sitting at the door knitting yarn. Manson whispered, "I don't want to go to court with them. When it comes to lawsuits, the one they can afford will always win." Jin Feng said, "What you said is absolutely right. I was just angry. I'm confused. In fact, people who are doing small business like us haven't suffered enough from the police. What else don't I know? What's the use of dragging them to the patrol room? Whoever has the money will be the murderer. Never. I will file a lawsuit against them, and at most ask them to come up with some money to compensate for the losses." Manson said, "I don't want their money." After hearing this, Jin Feng seemed to have a little more respect for her, and said, "Then you go out quickly. My Eileen Chang will come tomorrow and ask him to accompany you. Let's go out together, you or me, even if he is here to pick me up. If you can't walk, just ask him to help you." Manson hesitated for a moment and said, "That's good, but in case someone sees it, don't you want to hurt you?" Jin Feng laughed and said, "It's just the right time for them to come looking for me, and I'm going to slap you twice." When Manson heard what she said, She couldn't say a word. The gratitude in my heart is overflowing. Jin Feng said again. It's just that you have only given birth for a few days, so don't bring any problems by moving around like this. Manzin said, I don't think it matters. I can't care about this much. The two discussed it carefully again. Their voices were so soft that they couldn't hear clearly when their heads were on the pillow. So they always had to hold their heads in the air, which was very difficult. Talk about stopping. Look at the sky, is already twilight. The next afternoon, when it was time to allow family members to visit, Manzin was very anxiously looking forward to the arrival of Jin Feng's husband. Unexpectedly, before he came, Manlu came with Hong Kai. This was the first time for Hong Kai. Came to the hospital, never showed up before. He was holding a handful of flowers in his hand, looking very embarrassed. Manlu was carrying a food basket, which she brought with her simmered chicken soup every day. Manzin closed her eyes as soon as she saw them. Manlu gently called second sister with a smile. Manzin didn't answer. Hong Kai felt very uncomfortable standing there, so he had to look around, frown and said to Manlu, This room is so terrible. How can I live in it? Manlu said, Yes, it's really annoying. The better wards are all full. I told them that the first and second classrooms will be moved there as soon as they become available. Hong Kai held a bouquet of flowers in his hand and said, Call the nurse, bring me a vase. Manlu smiled and said, Ask her to bring the child to you to see. You haven't seen it yet. Then she was busy looking for a nurse. After a while of confusion, I brought the child over. Hong Kai had a son in middle age. When he saw this child, he simply didn't know how to love him. The couple played with the child, who started crying, and Manlu made various strange sounds to call him. Manzin kept his eyes closed and ignored them. Then I heard Hong Kai ask Manlu, Is the wet nurse who came yesterday okay? Manlu said, No, the test today said she has trachoma. The couple just played and sang, and Manzin suddenly said impatiently. She opened her eyes and said feebly, I want to sleep for a while. You should go back. Manlu was stunned for a moment. Then she said softly to Hong Kai, Second sister is worried about the noise. You should go first. Hong Kai turned around and left in frustration. But Manlu caught up with him, pinned him and asked in a low voice, Where are you going? Hong Kai muttered, not knowing how he answered her. She still didn't seem to understand. I was relieved, but had no choice but to say, Then when you get there, ask the car to come back and pick me up. Hong Kai left, but Manlu stood up silently, holding the child in her arms, sitting in front of Manzin's bed, gently shaking and patting the child. After a while, Fang said, He has wanted to see you for a long time, but he was afraid of making you angry. 2 days ago, when he saw you like this and heard the doctor saying it was dangerous, he was so anxious that he couldn't even eat. Manzin remained silent. Manlu took out a bright red carnation from the bouquet and dangled it in front of the child's eyes, and the child's head followed it. Manlu smiled and said, Hey, I already know that I like the color red. The child grabbed the flower in his hand, but couldn't hold it firmly, and the flower fell on Manzin's pillow. Manlu looked at Manzin's face and saw that she didn't look disgusted, so she whispered again, Second sister, do you hate a person for the rest of your life just because he is drunk and has no virtue and does something wrong? Then sent the child to her and said, Second sister, for the sake of this child, please forgive him. Manzin felt sad because she was about to leave her child, but she didn't expect to see him like this again after the last one. She did not look at the child, but silently hugged him and rubbed her cheek on his head. Manlu didn't know her psychology. Watching from the side, he became happy, thinking that Manzin had finally changed his mind. But he still couldn't let go of this face, and couldn't change his mind. At this critical moment, he had to be extra careful when speaking, so as not to offend her again. Therefore, Manlu also fell silent. Jin Feng's husband Eileen Chang has been here for a long time. Through a white cloth screen, you can hear them whispering. Jin Feng must have told him every detail of Manzin's story. They were also listening attentively to what was being said on the other side. When one side fell silent, the other side started talking again. Jin Feng asked him how many red eggs he had dyed, and who he had entrusted to look after him at the X-stall when he came here. They didn't have much to say. Lin Chang should have left long ago, but because he had to take Manzin with him, he had to wait. It seemed strange to sit there and say nothing, so I had to come up with something to say intermittently. Probably the couple had never had such a long conversation before, and found it very difficult. Lin Chang said that his sister has been helping at the X-stall these 2 days, and her sister is also pregnant. Jin Feng also told him how bad the caretakers here were. Man Lu just sat there and refused to leave. The time for family visits was almost over. Some family members brought snacks to the mother, and they ate chestnut shells all over the floor. After the family members left, a worker from the hospital came to sweep the floor with a broom, and swept slowly, and gradually came here. It means to chase away guests. Manzin was very anxious. Seeing those chestnut shells, she remembered that sugar-roasted chestnuts were on the market. It was not already late autumn, but she had been imprisoned in the Zhu family for almost a year. Suddenly she said to herself, "Is there chestnut flour cake now?" She suddenly became interested in food, and Manlu felt even more relieved. She hurriedly smiled and said, "Do you want to eat it? If you want to eat it, I'll give it to you. You buy it." Manzin said, "Maybe it's too late, right?" Manlu looked at her watch and said, "Then I'll go." Manzin became cold again and said lazily, "It's just for a trip, no need." "It's gone," Manlu said. "It's rare that you want to eat something and don't eat a little. You just eat too little, so your recovery is slow." After saying that, she had already put on her coat and sent the child to the caretaker, and left in a hurry. Manzin estimated that she had gone far away and was just tapping on the screen when Lin Chang had already come over here holding a roll of clothes to cover herself up. It is a plaid cheongsam, a wool scarf, and a pair of blue cloth shoes with loops from Jin Feng. He handed his hands to Manzin and left without saying a word. Manzin saw that both of his hands were bright red, which must have been dyed with red eggs. She couldn't help but smile, and felt a little disappointed, because she and Jin Feng also had children, but her own situation was so miserable. She hurriedly added Jin Feng's clothes to the outside, and then used the scarf to cover her head and face, hiding most of her face inside. Fortunately, pregnant women were always afraid of wind, so it didn't look special. He was dressed neatly, but he was already sweating from exhaustion. He stood on the ground, his feet fluttering as if he were stepping on cotton. She held onto the wall and slid to the screen. Lin Chang helped her away. She only had a quick glance at Jin Feng. Jin Feng had a long face with a yellow complexion, but very handsome eyebrows. Lin Chang's appearance was not bad either. He helped Manzin out. The nurse on duty sent Manzin's child to the baby's room, and had not returned yet, so they felt like they were in a deserted place. After going down this floor, of course no one knew them. After walking out of the gate, there were several rickshaws parked at the door. Manzin immediately got on one of them. Lin Chang asked the driver to put down the hood, saying that she was afraid of the wind, and put a raincloth in front of her. The rickshaw took us away, and we walked a long way and even crossed a bridge. It was already dark, and the eyes were full of scattered lights. Lin Chang lived in a back alley in Hangzhou, where he, his wife, and their children lived in a pavilion. As soon as Lin Chang arrived home and settled down with Manzin, he hurried out again and went to her home to deliver a letter. At the same time, she asked him to make a call to Zhu's house and find out if Mr. Shen Shijin was in Shanghai. If he was, she told him that a man named Gu was looking for him and asked him to come here. Lin Chang laughed, and Manzin was lying on their bed. The bed was quite big, and there was a 1-year-old child sleeping in the bed. Various pictorials are pasted on the peeling plaster walls. Instead of floral paper, there are photos of celebrities, photos of floods and droughts, comic strips and wedding photos. Some are colorful, some are black and white, some are brown, like hundreds of people on the stage, as bright as the robe. Next to the bed is a small long table. All daily necessities are placed on the table. Thermos bottles, old bottles, mirrors, cups and dishes are so crowded that no one can put their hands on them. A light bulb was hung on the roof. Under the light, Manzin looked at the lively little room. It was like she was dreaming when she came here. There was still a child lying beside her, but it was no longer her own child. The eldest of the 4 children of the Kai family was a 6 or 7-year-old girl. Before Lin Chang left, he threw some money to her and asked her to buy some cakes for dinner. The good woman in Zheopijian saw this and asked him who the new female guest was. He said she was his woman's little sister. However, this thing seemed really strange and made people a little suspicious that he took advantage of the woman's delivery in the hospital to take her away. A friend brought it home. The little girl came back from buying pancakes and shared them with her brothers and sisters. She handed a large piece to Manzin and placed it on the edge of the table. Manzin asked her to hand her a mirror on the table, and took a look in the mirror. She didn't even recognize herself. Her cheekbones were raised high, her face had no color at all, and even her lips were white. Yes, the eyes are big and dull. She stared blankly in the mirror for a long time, combing her hair with her hands, but the more hastily she got, the harder it became. She was very anxious, thinking that if Shi Junyi was in Shanghai, he might be here soon. In fact, Shi Jun happened to be in Shanghai these 2 days, but this time he came to stay at his uncle's house. He was here to prepare for the wedding and asked Shu Hui to be the best man. In addition, he had many things to buy. When he looked for Shu Hui, he went to Yang Shupu's dormitory and did not go to Shu Hui's house, so the Zhu family didn't know he was coming. Lin Chang called to ask, and Mrs. Zhu told him that Mr. Shen was not in Shanghai. Lin Chang went to Manzin's house according to the address Manzin gave him. A different family had already lived there, and there was a sign hanging at the door, and a dance school was opened. Lin Chang went to ask the man in the alley, and the man said that the Gu family had moved away long ago. At the end of last year, Lin Chang came back and told Manzin. Manzin was not surprised at all. This is nothing more than Manlu's plan to draw out the firepower. It can be seen that her mother is completely under the control of her sister. Even if she finds her mother at this time, it will be useless, or she will cause a lot of trouble. But what should she do now? Not only was she unaccompanied, but she was also penniless. Lin Chang left her to live here, and he went to stay at his sister's house that night. Manzin felt very dissatisfied. She didn't know that it was nothing for the poor to take care of each other in times of crisis. They always lived in the precarious situation, so they were particularly able to sympathize with those who suffered. And their sympathy was not restricted by various scruples like rich people. This was something she realized slowly later on. At that time, she was just secretly glad that she happened to meet Lin Chang and Jin Fang, a particularly loyal couple. That night, she borrowed a pencil and a piece of paper from their eldest girl, hoping to write a simple letter to Shi Jun, asking him to come quickly. Now that she could see him, she felt confused and uncertain about him. She remembered the conservative side of his personality. Even if he completely understands her, can he still love her as before? If he loved her desperately, then they wouldn't have quarreled at all when they last met. The reason for the quarrel was because he was too compromising on his family. If his marriage was not approved by his family at the beginning, it would certainly be out of the question now. If they knew that she had given birth to a child outside the home. Holding the pen in her hand, she felt at a loss. As a result, she wrote a very brief letter, saying that she had been ill since they broke up. She hoped that he could come to Shanghai as soon as possible after seeing the letter. She told him her current address and said nothing else. The signature also only has the character. She was also thinking that although Shi Jun had said before that no one would open his letters, what if someone else saw them? She sent an express letter. When the letter arrived in Nanjing, Shi Jun was still in Shanghai and had not returned yet. Although his mother was illiterate, Manzin often wrote letters in the past. There was a period when Shi Jun lived in his father's small mansion, and his mother personally brought his letters to him. She could also tell that she was a woman, looking at the child's handwriting. When I saw Manzin later, I guessed it was her and no one else. Now, after more than half a year, no letter came. Suddenly, another letter came. When Mrs. Shen saw it, she was very uneasy. She thought to herself that Shi Jun had already lived here and was about to get married. Don't let this letter come, about to change his mind again. After hesitating for a moment, she opened the letter and asked the eldest mistress to read it to her. The eldest mistress read it over and said, I think this woman looks like she has broken up with him. And now she pretends to be sick and tells him to go see her quickly. Mrs. Shen nodded silently. The two discussed it for a while and both said, "This letter cannot be seen by him." They burned it with a match on the spot. Since Manzin sent this letter, he has been counting the days every day. Although they had some bad blood in the past, she believed that he would come immediately after receiving the letter. She was very sure of this. She calculated that he would arrive within 3 or 4 days. But after waiting for more than a week, and waiting from morning to night, not only did he not come, but there was not even a reply. She wondered in her mind, could it be that he had heard about what happened to her elsewhere and was therefore unwilling to meet her again? He is indeed so heartless and ungrateful. It was a waste of time to get to know him. She was lying on the bed, with her eyes closed, but the tears just flowed out, and the pillow became cold and wet. Sometimes she would turn the pillow over and lay it on again, and sometimes the other side would be wet from crying. She thought about it, unless he didn't receive the letter at all and it was intercepted by his family. If that's the case, it would be useless to write it again and it would still be intercepted. I had no choice but to recuperate patiently, and when my body recovered, I would go to Nanjing to find him, but I don't have any money at hand, so I'm really in a hurry. Living in the Kai family, not only taking advantage of others, but also occupying the only room available, made Lin Chang unable to return home, which was really uneasy. She remembered that her office still had half a month's salary unpaid, and it could be used to help in emergencies. So she wrote a note and asked Lin Chang to send it to her. The factory sent someone back with him and handed the money to her face to face. She heard the man say that they had hired another typist. After getting the money, she rented an empty pavilion on the 3rd floor and moved upstairs. Lin Chang bought more planks and necessary pieces of furniture for her, and he continued to provide tea and meals. Manzin gave him some of her remaining money as food money, but he would definitely not accept it, saying that she would pay them back slowly when she found a job in the future. At this time, Jin Feng had also returned from the hospital and was recuperating at home. Manzin must have forced her to accept the money, so Jin Feng took matters into her own hands and asked Lin Chang to cut a few feet of thread and match it. Lizzie gave it to the tailor shop in Nongku to make a robe for Manzin, otherwise she would not even have any clothes. Jin Feng still paid her back the extra money and asked her to keep the pocket change. Manzin couldn't resist her, so she had to keep it. When Jin Feng was discharged from the hospital, she told her that when Man Lu came back from buying chestnut flour cake that day, she found that Manjin had disappeared, but she didn't pursue the matter and just took the child back that day. Manzin guessed that they must be guilty, so they didn't dare to say anything, as long as they could save their children. After all, Manzin was in good health, and he recovered quickly even at a young age, and he soon became healthy. She immediately went to find Shu Hui, wanting to ask him to find trouble. At the same time, she also thought that by chance, she might be able to see Shijin if he was in Shanghai. She chose a Saturday evening to go to Zhu's house, because Shu Hui had more chances to be at home at that time. Walking in from the back door, he met Shu Hui's mother working in the kitchen, and Manzin called her aunt. Mrs. Su smiled and said, "Hey, Miss Gu, I haven't seen you for a long time." Manzin smiled and said, "Shu Hui is at home, right?" Mrs. Su smiled and said, "He is at home." What a coincidence. He just came back from Nanjing. Jin groaned, thinking that Shu Hui had been to Nanjing again, and it was Shijin who invited him there. She walked up to the 3rd floor, and when people in the room heard the sound of her leather shoes, an unknown girl came out and looked at her with a questioning look. Manzin suspected that she had gone to the wrong house, so she smiled and said, "Is Mr. Shu Hui at home?" When she asked, Shu Hui came out and said with a smile, "Hey, it's you, please come in, please come in." "This is my sister." Manzin then remembered that she was the girl that Shijin had helped her with arithmetic, and felt confused. After sitting down in the room, Shu Hui said with a smile, "I was looking for you there, and you came right here." At this point, his sister brought a cup of tea and stopped talking. Manzin was a little confused, thinking that he might have heard about Shijin's breakup with her and wanted to make peace with them. Maybe it was Shijin who asked him. Then she took the tea and took a sip, then struck up a conversation with Shu Hui's sister. His sister was probably at a shy age. She stood there with a smile on her face for a while and then went out again. Shu Hui smiled and said, "I'm leaving soon." Then he told her about his going abroad. Manson was naturally happy for him. But after he reported the news from beginning to end, he still didn't mention Zhen. She felt very strange. Otherwise, she would have asked about it a long time ago. But for some reason, the more scared she felt, the less she dared to ask. Could it be that he knew they had a falling out, so he didn't mention it? Unless Zhen told him, they were doomed. If she hadn't gone through this, she still wouldn't be willing to take such a breath in front of Shu Hui. She picked up the teacup and drank tea. She looked around and said with a smile, "Why has this house changed?" Shu Hui said with a smile, "My sister lives here now." Manson said with a smile, "No wonder, I said it was so neatly tidied up. It was all in such a mess for the two of you before." The two of you she refers to, of course, refers to Zhen and Shu Hui. She thought that by saying this, Shu Hui would definitely mention Zhen, but he did not take the blame. Manson then asked him when he was leaving, and Shu Hui said, "I'll leave early the day after tomorrow." Manson smiled and said, "It's a pity that I couldn't come to you earlier. Originally, I wanted to ask you to find trouble for me." Shu Hui said. Manson said, "Why, aren't you in trouble? You're not there anymore." Manson said, "I got a serious illness, and they couldn't wait, so they hired someone else." Shu Hui said, "No wonder. What did I say to you? You've lost weight." He asked her what illness she had, and she casually said it was typhoid fever. He asked her to go to a foreign bank to find someone named Wu. He heard that they were looking for someone to hire, so he called her to hire someone first. After talking for a long time, Zhen was never mentioned. Manson finally asked with a smile, "Have you been to Nanjing recently?" Shu Hui said with a smile, "Hey, how did you know?" Manson said with a smile, "I just heard what my aunt said." At this point, Shu Hui said, still not mentioning Zhen. He lit a match and lit a cigarette, threw the match out the window, then stood there, facing the window, and took a deep breath of smoke. Manson couldn't bear it any longer, so she walked over and stood next to him with her hands on the windowsill. She smiled and said, "Did you see Zhen when you went to Nanjing?" Shu Hui said with a smile, "He was the one who came to see me. He got married the day before yesterday." Manson pressed his hands on the windowsill, feeling that the windowsill was undulating, and he didn't know how the solid wood could become like a wave, making him unable to hold it. Seeing that she seemed stunned, Shu Hui smiled again and said, "Didn't you hear? He married Miss Shi. You have seen it, right?" Manson said, "Oh, we met in Nanjing that time, Shu Hui seemed unwilling to say more about this matter. Of course, Manson thought it was because he knew about her relationship with Zhen. She didn't know that he was also depressed because of Cuizhi. Manson didn't sit down to talk anymore and said, "You are leaving the day after tomorrow. You must be very busy these 2 days. I won't confuse you." Shu Hui left her to eat and wanted to go out to eat with her. Manson smiled and said, "I won't bid farewell to you, and you don't need to treat me to a treat. You're free of charge." Shu Hui wanted to exchange correspondence addresses with her, but he didn't have an address when he went to the United States, so he only wrote her a school address. When she walked out of Shu Hui's house, she felt like the world had changed. She really didn't expect that she had been locked up in Zhu's house for nearly a year, and when she ran out, the world had changed outside. In less than a year, has Zhen already married someone else? She walked under the street lights and walked a long way before she remembered that she should take the tram, but she took the wrong tram. The tram did not cross the bridge and stopped on the bund. She had to get off and walk on her own. It probably rained a little bit just now, so the ground was a little damp. Gradually we walked to the bridge. The electric lights on the steel bridge were brightly lit. The huge black shadow of the bridge, with its large black bars, stretched across the gray-yellow water. There are many small boats moored under the bridge, and the long shadows also fall on the awnings and planks of the boats. There was no light on the water. Don't you know how deep the water here is? The flat surface of the water was like gray-yellow cement. If you jumped, you wouldn't know whether you would fall to death or drown. Trucks rumbled past on the bridge, and the ground shook, making people feel numb under their feet. She just stood by the bridge with her back on her back and stared blankly towards the water. No matter how bad others treat her, not even her own sister or mother can make her sad like Zhen. I heard the news about him at Shu Hui's house just now. She seemed to have been given anesthesia during the operation. She was confused and didn't feel much pain. Now she is gradually waking up and the pain is beginning. The boats under the bridge were all dark, with no lights on, and everyone on board must have been asleep. It was probably very late, and Jin Fang also told her that she must go back for dinner, because today's food was particularly good and their child was 1 month old today. Manzin thought about her own child again, wondering if she was still alive. I really don't know how that night passed, but since people are alive, they have to live day by day. Soon after, she found a job, teaching in a school, and the pay was not good, just so that she could have a place to live. She moved out from Jin Fang's place and lived in the teacher's dormitory. She used to teach in a young family, and her two children were very close to her. Now it was the young family who introduced this matter to her. The young family only knew that she was unemployed because of illness, and everyone in her family had returned home. She went to the countryside, and she was left alone in Shanghai. Now she lives in school and rarely goes out, and it is rare for her to go to Yang's house. One day, 2 or 3 years later, she went to Yang's house to play. Mrs. Young told her that her mother had been here yesterday and asked them if they knew where she was now. Mrs. Young probably thought it was strange how her mother didn't know. She told her mother her address. When Manzin heard this, he knew there must be trouble. It's not that she hasn't missed her mother in the past 2 years, but she really doesn't want to see her. When she came out of Yang's house that day, she simply didn't want to go back to the dormitory. On second thought, it was inevitable that her mother would find her way there sooner or later. When she went back that day, her mother was already waiting in the reception room. Mrs. Gu shed tears as soon as she saw her. Manzin just called Mom lightly. Mrs. Gu said, "You've lost weight." Manzin didn't say anything, nor did she ask where they live now or how their family was doing. Because she knew her sister must be there to support them, Mrs. Gu had no choice but to tell her everything on her own initiative, saying, "Your grandma's health has been very strong these past 2 years, and it's better than before. The eldest brother will graduate this summer. You probably don't know, but we live in Suzhou now," Manzin said. "I only know that you moved from Jikingfang. I guess it was my sister's idea." She arranged it very thoughtfully. As he said that, he couldn't help but sneered. Mrs. Gu sighed. "You don't like to hear what I said. In fact, your sister doesn't have bad intentions. It's just the blame. Now that you have given birth to a child, why do you have to go out alone? I'm suffering." Listening to her mother's words, Manzin seemed to feel pity for her being homeless and wanted to ask her to go back to Ju's house and become a ready-made concubine. She turned red with anger and said, "Mom, don't say these things to me. If you do, I can't help but get angry." Mrs. Gu wiped her tears and said, "I'm doing this for your own good." Manzin said, "It's good for me. You really hurt me. I don't know what my sister told you at that time. How could you let them lock me in the house for those days? Their hearts are too poisonous. Then if I had been sent to the hospital earlier, I wouldn't have suffered the consequences and almost lost my life," Mrs. Gu said. "I know you want to blame me. It's also because I know you are impatient. So I think as an old man like me I got up and thought that you had no choice but to marry Hong Kai. It's rare that your sister was so angry that she even said that you would officially get married. Actually, let me tell you, you are still too stubborn. What will you do if you continue like this in the future?" At this point, Ming gradually began to sob and cry. Manzin didn't say anything at first, but then she said a little impatiently, "Mom, don't do this. What's the point of showing it to others?" Mrs. Gu tried her best to stop her screams and sat there wiping her eyes with a handkerchief and blowing her nose. After a long while, she muttered to herself, "My child is smart now. He can talk about anything. He doesn't recognize people when he sees them, and just chases me. Call her grandma. She was so thin when she was raised, but now she is white and fat." Manzin remained silent, and then finally said, "Don't say more. No matter what, I will never come to Shu's house again. Go. The school bell rang. It was time for dinner. Manzin said, Mom, it's time to go back. It's getting late. Mrs. Gu could only sigh and stood up, saying, I think you should think about it again. I'll see you again tomorrow. But she hasn't come back since that time, probably because Manzin was too cruel to her, which made her feel frustrated. She must have gone back to Suzhou again. Manzin also felt that she might have gone too far, but with the Zhu family in the middle, she really couldn't interact with her mother, otherwise she would be even more entangled. A lot of time passed. It's winter vacation, and everyone in the dormitory has gone home to celebrate the new year. Only Manzin is left homeless. She was the only one living on the entire floor. She moved to the best room, but she was really calm. There is no place more desolate than a schoolhouse during the holidays. One afternoon, she had nothing to do and felt cold while sitting, so she got into bed and fell asleep. Taking a nap in summer is a very comfortable and natural thing, but taking a nap in winter is unpleasant and makes people feel drowsy. The room was filled with the light yellow setting sun. There was an old clothes drying rope hanging out of the glass window. The wind blew the rope, and the shadow of the rope shot straight into the room, like the shadow of a person flickering. Manzin suddenly woke up. She was still a little dazed after waking up for a long time. Suddenly, she heard the schoolmate shouting from downstairs, Mr. Gu, someone is coming to see you at home. She thought to herself that her mother was here again, but she heard a chaotic sound of footsteps outside. And there was definitely more than one person. Manzin thought, what are all these people doing here? She composed herself and hurriedly put on her clothes and got up, but these people had already walked in. A Bao and Zhang Ma were supporting Manlu, followed by a wet nurse holding the child. A Bao called Miss Second, and before he had time to say anything, he helped Manlu to the bed, piled the quilt into a pile, and let her lean on it. Manlu was so thin that her whole body shrank, but the layers of clothes she wore were very bulky, which made her look fatter. She was wearing a camel hair coat, a wool scarf on her head, and her mouth was covered. Only her eyes were half open and half covered. Her pale face was covered with sweat, and she was sitting there panting. A Bao ranged her hands and feet for her to make her sit more comfortable. Manlu whispered, you guys go to the car and wait for me. Leave the child here. A Bao took the child and put it on the bed, and then went downstairs with the nanny and the others. The child was wearing a brand new set of maroon plush sweaters and trousers, as if he had been specially dressed up to show it to Manzin. He also had powder on his face and a round red rouge. He was crawling all over the bed, mumbling words that were incomprehensible, pulling Manlu and telling her to look at this and that. Manzin stood in front of the window with her arms folded. Looking at them, Manlu said, Second sister, look at my illness. It doesn't look like I can survive for a few months. Manzin couldn't help but snorted and sneered. Why do you need to curse yourself? Manlu paused for a moment. Dun just said, it's no wonder you don't believe me, but this time it's really true. My constipation will never be cured. She herself felt that she was like that deceiving shepherd boy who repeatedly shouted, Wolf, it's coming. The wolf is coming. When the wolf really comes, no one will believe him. The air in the room was freezing, and when she spoke, it was like stepping into cold water with her bare feet. Yet she had to go on. She said in a trembling voice, you don't know, my life in the past 2 years has not been like a human being. Hong Kai has been fooling around outside all day long. If it weren't for this child, he would have abandoned me long ago. You want to wait for me to die? This child may have fallen into the hands of some woman. So I beg you, you should go back. Manzin said, you don't need to talk about these nonsense anymore. Manlu said again, you don't believe me when I tell you, in fact, it's true. Hong Kai admires you. He treats you just like other women. If you take care of him, you will definitely take care of him well. Manzin said angrily, who am I, Zhu Hong Kai? Why should I care? Him? Manlu said. Then let's not talk about him. Just look at the poor child. How miserable he would be if I died. You will always raise the child. Manzin was stunned for a while and said, I'll try to find a way to bring him out tomorrow. Manlu said, how can that be done? Hong Kai will never do it. Even if you sue him, he will lose all his money to litigate you. Yes, it's so easy to have such a precious son. How can I let him go? Manzin said. I also thought it would be difficult. Manlu said, yes, otherwise I wouldn't come to you. This is the only way. You can marry him after I die. Manzin said, don't say such things. I will never marry Zhu Hong Kai even if I die. Manlu struggled to pick up the child. He sent it to Manzin and sighed. Isn't it just for him that you come and go? Your heart is so cruel. Manzin really didn't want to hold the child because she didn't want to shed tears in front of Manlu, but Manlu just panted and took the child over. Before she reached out to pick it up, the child started crying, turned away and shouted Mom, Mom, and hid in Manlu's arms. Of course, he only recognized Manlu as his mother, but Manzin suddenly became unreasonable at that time. She felt very excited when she saw her child like that. Manlu felt sad because her child was so attached to her. She choked and said to Manzin, I'm going to die now. And there's nothing else I can't leave behind. I just don't trust him. I really can't bear it. At this point, I couldn't help but burst into tears. Manzin didn't necessarily feel better than her. Later, when he saw her crying more and gasping for breath, Manzin couldn't bear it anymore. So he had to harden his heart and frown in disgust and said, Look at you. Why don't you go back quickly? After saying that, he immediately turned around and ran downstairs, called Bo and Zhang Ma from the car, and asked them to help Manlu downstairs. Manlu just walked away crying, and the wet nurse followed her with the child in her arms. Manzin was alone in the room. She folded the quilts that were piled up on the bed, then sat down on the edge of the bed and was in a daze for a while. She got angry whenever Hong Kai was mentioned at all. In addition to hatred, she also had an instinctive hatred for him, so she rejected her sister's request without thinking. Now calm down and think about it carefully. She is right to do this. It's not that she doesn't care about her child. Now she has no second family member in the world except this child. If he could be taken out and raised by her, although an unmarried mother would be discriminated against in this society, she would not be afraid of anything. You can sacrifice anything for him, but you can't marry Hong Kai. She didn't plan to live here any longer because she was afraid that Manlu would come to pester her again or call her mother to find her again. She submitted her resignation to the school, but because she had already accepted the appointment letter for the next semester before the winter vacation, she resigned after a lot of effort and found a job as an accountant elsewhere. She studied accounting before. I found a job and then looked for an apartment. I rented a room from someone else's house. The second landlord's surname was Guer. One day she came back from work and walked to the back door of Gu's house. A young woman happened to walk out of the house. She had a round face, yellow and black skin. Her cheeks were rouged red, and her hair hung high on both sides of her temples. Wearing a white gown, red and yellow floral linen cheongsam, it turned out to be Po. How did they find them here again? Manzin was stunned for a moment. Bao seemed very surprised when he saw her, and called out, Hey, Miss Second. There was a man following behind Bao. Manzin recognized him as someone from the head shop, and then remembered that an old lady from the Guer family returned to her hometown. After going down, their family hired a maid from a recommendation shop to try out the job 2 days ago. She probably wasn't suitable, so they looked for someone else. It seemed that Bao came to Gu's house to work and was not ordered to come to Manzin. But Manzin still didn't bother to pay attention to her, because when he saw her, he couldn't help but remember that she was also an accomplice when he was detained in Zhu's house. Of course, as servants, they had nothing to do. They had to listen to other people's orders to eat, so they couldn't blame her very much. But no matter what, Manzin always felt very unhappy when he saw her, so he only nodded slightly. His footsteps never stopped. He continued walking inside. But Bao caught up and shouted, The second lady probably doesn't know. The eldest lady is gone. This news shouldn't be unexpected. But Manzin was still surprised and said, Oh, when was she gone? Bao said, Well, it was that time I went to your school. And it was less than half a month later. As he said that, his eyes turned red and he shed a few tears. She cried, but Manzin just looked at her blankly, feeling empty in his heart. Bao put a finger on his handkerchief, wiped the corners of his eyes carefully, and then said to the person at the head shop, "Do you want to go back first? I want to say a few words to my old boss," but Manzin said, not wanting to talk to her anymore. He said, "You'd better go if you have something to do. Don't delay your business." Bao also felt that Manzin was very cold to her, thinking that it was all about the previous ring. So he said, "Second, miss, I know you must have blamed me for not sending you a letter at that time. Well, you don't even know. Do you know why you didn't let me come to your room later?" As soon as she said this, Manzin stopped her with a frown. She asked, "Why do you talk about it after these things?" Bao looked at her face and became silent. He hugged his own arms and just stroked them. After a while, Fang said, "I don't work at his house now. I'm so angry. You don't know, second lady. As soon as the eldest lady died, Joe's mother said bad things about me in front of my uncle. This week's mother is very good at flattering, so she came here. After a few months, the wet nurse was removed, and the young master was taken care of by her. She pretended to treat the young master very well in front of my uncle, but behind my back he was like a late-night lady. I really couldn't stand it, so I left." She suddenly became so righteous. Manzin felt that what she said should be discounted somewhat, but it was probably the truth that she was squeezed out by other servants in the Shu family. She was obviously very angry, as if she had nothing to say, but Manzin didn't invite her in, so she stood at the back door and started talking endlessly. He added, "My uncle has always lost money in business, so his temper has become even worse. He has almost lost all his belongings. The house on Hongqiao Road has also been sold. Now they have moved to Daanli. It is said that the eldest lady has it's true that it helps the husband's luck. As soon as the eldest lady dies, he will be unlucky. He himself also regrets it. He has always been unlucky and dozing at home, and the women outside are all broken. I often see him talking about the eldest daughter. The photo of the lady made her cry." When he mentioned Hongkai, Manzin showed an impatient look, as if he had been standing at the back door for too long. After all, Bao knew what was going on, so he didn't say any more. He turned around and asked, "Second miss, you live here now?" Manzin only responded vaguely, and then asked her, "Is it okay for you to come here? Are you here to work?" Bao said with a smile, "Yes, but I see there are a lot of people here and the wages are not big, so I don't want to do it. I'll ask the second lady." "Okay, if the second lady has any friends who need help, just come and call me. I'll be at the recommended shop across the street." Manzin agreed casually. There was a moment of silence. Manzin really hoped that she would tell more about the child. How tall he was and how naughty he was. A child could create many anecdotes and good stories, which the maids were happy to tell. Manzin also wanted to know, where did he speak with an accent? Is he still strong? Is your temper good? Bao didn't say anything, but Manzin didn't want to ask her. She didn't know why she was so shy. Bao smiled and said, "Then I'm leaving, Miss Second." After she left, Manzin also went in. Bao said that the Zhu family now lives in Daanli, and Manzin often walks there. She takes the tram every day, and there is a long way from her home to the tram station. Daanli is a place she must pass, and now she walks here. I always walk across the street, worried that I might run into Hongkai. Although I am not afraid that he will get entangled with me. He is annoying after all. On this day, when she came back from get off work, to primary school students who came back from school were walking in front of her. She has to guess the age of any child she sees these days, and at the same time she calculates the age of her own child, wondering if that child is as tall as that. Of course, these two children were older than her children. They were always about 7 or 8 years old. They were all wearing new blue cloth burqas over their cotton robes, and they were very fat. The two walked side by side like soldiers, raising the abacus in their hands in unison, making a rhythmic move, making the abacus beads make a loud sound of batch, batch, as military music of encouragement. Sometimes the abacus is carried on the shoulder to represent a gun. Manzin was behind them, and occasionally heard snippets of their conversation, but their conversation was too unambitious. One child said, Ma Zhenglin's father owns a bakery, and Ma Zhenglin has bread to eat every day. He looked envious. They suddenly crossed the road and walked into Dianli. Manzin couldn't help being shocked. Although she knew that this was definitely not her child, and there were many children in this alley, she couldn't help but followed them across the road and walked into the alley. After all, her steps were a little hesitant, so when she walked in, the two children had already disappeared. It was February or March in spring, a cold gray afternoon. Spring is often like this. Before you can smell the breath of spring, you first feel that everything smells. In addition to being cold, your body feels a little itchy and dirty. Although it didn't rain, the ground in the alley was still wet and sticky. When we walked in, there were shikumen houses on both sides, and a load of dried stinky tofu was parked in the middle. The person carrying the load stood a little further away with his hands on his hips, shouting in a long voice. A little girl bought a bunch of stinky dried tofu on the load and spread hot sauce on it herself. It seems that the daughter of Hung Sai's ex-wife is recruiting a younger brother. Before Manzin had time to take a closer look at her, her eyes were attracted to a boy next to her. A boy of 4 or 5 years old. He and Zhaodi were clearly siblings. They were both wearing the same purple cotton robe. Although it was already spring, they were still wearing old cotton shoes, but they were barefoot without socks. And their red ankles looked strangely miserable against the old black cotton shoes. The boy's hair was long, covering his eyebrows, and although his face was dirty, he seemed very handsome. Manzin was so flustered that she didn't have time to take a closer look, but turned her attention back to Zhaodi, wanting to carefully identify whether she was Zhaodi. Although they had only met once, several years ago, Manzin remembered him clearly. A child is expected to change the fastest, but this sallow-looking little girl has always looked the same, and has not even grown taller at all. In fact, of course, it is not that she has not grown taller, as evidenced by her too short robe. Brother Zhao stood beside the load of dried tofu, picked out hot sauce from a small earthen jar and spread it on the dried tofu. Probably because the hot sauce is free, I smeared it on generously, like spreading marmalade on bread, turning the whole piece of dried tofu bright red. The burden bearer glanced at her, as if he wanted to speak, but he didn't. Zhaodi bought 3 pieces in total, put them on a piece of straw, held them in his hand and ate them. Her brother also wanted to eat. He stood on tiptoes, threw his hands on her body, raised his face, and took a bite. Manzin thought to herself that if she took this bite, it would be so spicy that she would burst into tears and her throat would be burned. She unconsciously sweated for him, but he actually swallowed it without changing his expression, and kept eating, still standing on tiptoes and putting his mouth to it. Brother Zhao was also very friendly, taking a bite himself and letting him take another bite. Manzin couldn't help but smile when she saw her child's silly look, but as she smiled, tears already fell from her eyes. She turned away hastily, turned around and walked to the alley, raising the back of her hand to wipe her tears. As she walked, suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, it was Zhaodi who was chasing after her. Her cotton shoes were getting bigger and bigger as she stepped on the damp cement. She inhaled and made a chirping sound. Manzin thought, oh no, she must know me. I thought she was young at the time and only saw me once, so she must not remember it. Manzin had to turn her head and pretend to look for the house number, and walked all the way. I looked at the Zhaodi from the corner of my eye. He was standing at the door of a family's house. This family must have recently performed Buddhist rituals. Half of the yellow paper strips on the door frame had just been torn off and were now burned in the courtyard. Paper money, blazing fire. Brother Zhao watched them burning tinfoil and eating her stinky dried tofu. He didn't seem to pay any attention to Manzin. Manzin just felt relieved and walked back calmly and walked out. There is now a maid beside the boy. The maid is about 40 years old, with a sinister face and a small black eyes like tadpoles. She holds a bench and sits at the back door to pick vegetables. Zhen thought to himself that this must be the Zhou Ma that Abao was talking about. Zhaodi saw her coming out, so he fled to the alley, probably hiding there and eating the dried tofu before coming back. Manzin walked slowly past them. When the child saw her, he didn't know whether he liked her face or her clothes. He suddenly shouted Andy. Manson turned around and smiled at him, and he shouted Andy, Auntie, in succession. The maid then muttered, when I ask you to shout, I don't shout, and when I don't ask you to shout, I keep shouting. Manson walked out of the alley and walked past more than a dozen stores, her heart still beating fast. Passing by a shop window, she smiled at the shadow in the window. It's hard to see what is there about her that makes a child fall in love with her and shout Andy, Auntie, as soon as he sees her. She kept hearing the child's voice. She thought carefully about his appearance again. The last time her sister brought him to her, he couldn't walk at that time. He was crawling all over the bed, like a cute little animal. But now he is a person with personality. Character. This time I was lucky and saw him as soon as I walked in. I can't go there again. It's useless to see too much. It's just sad in vain. As for her mother, she thought that now that her sister was dead, Hong Kai would not have the spare money to subsidize her mother. So Manson sent a sum of money to her mother, but did not write her own address because she was still unwilling. Her mother came to see her. Summer has arrived in a blink of an eye. Her mother said last time that her eldest brother will graduate this summer, and he can go out to make money after graduation. However, Manson always feels that he has just gone out to work, and it is absolutely impossible for him to support such a family alone. Impossible. She sent them another sum of money. She gradually gave them some of her savings over the past 2 years. The weather was very hot that day, and it suddenly started raining heavily in the evening. The second landlady's maid rushed to the balcony to rescue her clothes that had been hung out to dry. Someone rang the bell downstairs, but no one opened the door after ringing for a long time. Manson had no choice but to run downstairs. When she opened the door, she saw a strange young woman. The young woman smiled at Manson a little awkwardly and said, "Can I make a phone call? I live in No. 9 right across the street." It was raining outside, so Manson asked her to come in and wait. She smiled and said, "I'll call Mrs. Goer." After several calls, no one answered. The maid came downstairs with a roll of clothes in her arms and said, "Mrs. Not at home." Manson had no choice but to lead the young woman to the hall where the phone was installed. The young woman first picked up the phone book to look up the number. Manson turned on the light for her. Under the light, she saw that although the young woman was wearing a cloak-like raincoat, it could still be seen that she was pregnant. Her hair is straight and long and tucked behind her ears. She doesn't look like a Shanghai woman, but she doesn't have the atmosphere of a small city. She has a pretty face with a slightly flat oval face. She spent a lot of time looking up the phone book and seemed a little apologetic. From time to time she raised her head and smiled at Manson, chatting up Manson and asking him his last name. She said her last name was Zhang. He also asked Manson where he was from, and Manson said he was from Anhui. But she immediately paid attention and said with a smile, "Miss Gu is from Anhui. Where is Anhui?" Manson said, "Liyuan." The young woman smiled and said, "Hey, I just came from Liyuan." Manson smiled. She asked, "Is Mrs. Zhang also from Liyuan?" She doesn't have a Liyuan accent. The young woman said, "I'm from Shanghai. I've always lived here. It's our Mr. Zhang. He's from Liyuan." Manson thought, after thinking for a while. He said, "Oh, there is a Dr. Zhang Yujin in Liyuan. Does Mrs. Zhang know him?" The young woman paused for a moment, then laughed in a low voice. "His name is Yujin." Manson smiled. "What a coincidence," she said. "We are relatives," the young woman exclaimed, and said with a smile, "What a coincidence. Yujin is also here this time. When will Miss Gu come to our place to play? I live here now, my mother's house." She dialed the number, and Manson walked away and walked around in the back after her call was finished. He came back to see her out. Originally, she was going to leave her sitting for a while and wait for the rain to subside before leaving, but she said that she still had something to do. A relative invited them to dinner today. She just called Yujin about this matter and asked him to go directly to the restaurant. After she left, Manson returned to her room upstairs and listened to the sound of rain that came hard and slow, not seeming like it was going to stop. She thought that if Yujin knew that she lived here, he would definitely come to see her in 2 days. She was a little afraid of seeing him, because when she saw him, she would think of her experiences in the past few years after they broke up. That nightmare-like period had nothing to do with her life in the past 20 years, and it had nothing to do with the people Zhen knew. She has nothing to do with it. She very much needed to talk to him about these things. Otherwise, it would seem to be a terrifying world hidden in her heart forever. When she thought about it like this, memories from the past immediately came flooding back, and she knew she would not be able to sleep tonight. It was hot that day. It was raining and she couldn't open the window. She lay on the bed and kept fanning herself, which made her sweat all over. It was almost 10 o'clock when the doorbell rang suddenly. The maid who was sleeping in the kitchen was confused and asked angrily, "Who is it?" Who are you looking for?" Manzin suddenly had an idea. As soon as he moved, he guessed that Zhen must be here. She hurriedly got up from the bed, turned on the light, hurriedly put on her clothes, and ran downstairs. Because it was night, the maid didn't dare let the stranger in easily. It was Zhen, standing at the back door in a raincoat, wiping her face with a handkerchief, and glistening drops of water streaming from her hair. He nodded to Manzin and said with a smile, "I just came back. I heard that you live here." Manzin didn't know why, but when she saw him, she immediately felt all kinds of bitterness welling up in her heart. Fortunately, she was standing with her back with the light on. People couldn't see the tears in her eyes. She immediately turned away and led the way upstairs. Fortunately, she always walked in front, and no one saw her face. After entering the room, she rushed to cover the bed with a sheet. While turning her back to make the bed, she finally held back her tears. Zhen walked into the room, looked round, and said, "Why do you live here alone? Are the old lady and the others okay?" Manzin could only answer vaguely, "They have moved to Suzhou now." Zhen seemed surprised. Manzin could have taken this opportunity to mention the things she was going to tell him. She saw Zhen was so enthusiastic. When he heard that she lived here, he came to see her in the rain all night. This shows that he cares about her. Their friendship remained the same, and she was even more determined to tell him everything. But there is a kind of words that are difficult to say, but on the contrary, you can tell them with all your heart to a person you meet by chance. The last time she was in the hospital, she told Zhen Fang her life story, and she didn't feel as embarrassed as she does now to Zhen. She changed the topic and said with a smile, "What a coincidence, I happened to meet your wife. When did you come to Shanghai?" Zhen said, "We have been here only a few days. It was because she needed an operation. The hospitals nearby didn't have good equipment, so I came to Shanghai." Manzin didn't ask in detail why his wife needed surgery. He guessed that it was always because of childbirth, and he probably knew in advance that it would be difficult to give birth. Zhen added, "She will be admitted to the hospital tomorrow. This is her mother's home now." He sat down. His raincoat was wet and he didn't take it off. Of course, he was not prepared to sit for a long time because it was too late. Manzin poured a glass of boiling water and put it in front of him, and said with a smile, "You guys have a party today, right?" Zhen said with a smile, "Yes, we had dinner in Jinjiang. We just left now. They went back, so I came here directly." Zhen probably drank some wine. His face was red, and he was wearing a raincoat indoors. He also felt very stuffy. He picked up a newspaper on the table and used it as a fan. Manzin handed him a banana fan and opened the window halfway. As soon as he opened the window, he saw that the row of houses across the street were dark, and almost all the lights were turned off. Zhen's people in Yu's house must have gone to bed. If Zhen stays here for too long, although his wife will not worry too much, her family may gossip. Manzin then thought that they would have to meet each other in the future anyway. So, what she wanted to tell him should be told to him later, but since Zhen stepped into her room, she felt strange. Why was Manzin so lonely now? Her family moved to the mainland, perhaps to save money. Where was Shen Shijin? Why haven't they gotten married yet? Zhen couldn't help but ask, "Do you still see Shen Shijin often?" Manzin smiled and said, "I haven't seen him for a long time. He went back to Nanjing several years ago." Zhen said, "Oh." Manzin was silent for a moment, and said again, "Later I heard that he got married." After hearing this, Zhen felt speechless. In the silence, I suddenly heard a rustling sound. It was raindrops swooping in and hitting the books. There were several books on the table, and they were all wet. Eugen smiled and said, "You still can't open your window." He picked up a book, took out his handkerchief and wiped away the water stains on the book. Manson said, "Let it go. There is dust on it and it will stain your handkerchief." But Eugen still cherished it and wiped all the books dry, because he remembered that he used to live in Manson at home. The radio next door kept her awake at night. How could she lend him a book? If it hadn't been for Shen Shijin at that time, their situation might be very different now, right? Anxious to interrupt his thoughts, he immediately spoke and talked about his current situation, saying, "There is no money to be made in running a hospital in such a small place, and some equipment cannot be saved, so we have to hire less people. The two of us should be busy by ourselves. Although I was born and raised here, I rarely interacted with local people. When Rongshan first went there, she was a little unaccustomed to this kind of lonely life and felt bored. Later she learned to nurse and help in the hospital, so I won't be lonely when I have something to do." Rongshan must be his wife's name. He felt that the conversation had lasted long enough, so he suddenly stood up and said with a smile, "Let's go." Manson didn't keep him because it was getting late. She sent him downstairs. Eugen suddenly remembered something on the stairs and asked, "Last time I was here, I heard that your sister was sick. Is she well now?" Manson whispered, "She died. It happened not long ago." Eugen said in confusion, "I heard that it was intestinal tuberculosis that time. Is that the problem?" Manson said, "Oh, that time. It wasn't that bad that time, seriously. That time it was her sister who pretended that her life was at stake and made a trap to frame her." Manson paused, then smiled lightly and said, "I didn't even go to her death. A lot has happened in the past 2 years. I'll tell you when you have time." Eugen couldn't help but stand still, looked at her, as if he was willing to listen to her right away. But when he saw that her face suddenly looked very tired, he didn't say anything and turned around and went downstairs. She delivered it all the way to the back door. She came back upstairs. There was the only sofa chair in her room, which Eugen had just sat on. There were a few wet marks on the chair, which were stained by the watermarks on his raincoat. Manson stared at the water stains for a while, feeling unspeakably melancholy in her heart. It started raining suddenly today. Eugen didn't necessarily bring a raincoat when he went out. His wife must have brought the raincoat to the restaurant for him. Of course, they have a very good relationship, which can also be heard in Eugen's tone of voice. What about Shijin? Is his married life equally happy? I haven't thought of him for a long time. She herself thought her pain had been dulled for a long time, but the pain seemed to be the only living thing in her body. It was always fresh and intense, and would not give her a moment's rest once it started. She poured Eugen's cup of tea into the spittoon and poured another cup for herself. Somehow, the boiling water from the thermos bottle rushed out and poured all over her feet. She was numb and didn't feel much, as if she had been hit by a hammer on the top of her feet, but it didn't hurt. It rained that night until dawn, and Manson didn't fall asleep until dawn. She had just slept for a while when someone suddenly woke her up. It seemed that when she was still in the hospital, at dawn, the nurse would bring the baby to breastfeed. She held the child in her arms in a daze, feeling a mixture of sadness and joy in her heart, as if the child had been lost and found. But she suddenly found that the child was cold all over. He didn't know when he died, and he was already stiff. She hugged him tighter and pressed his face to her chest, fearing that others would discover that he was a dead child. However, it has been discovered, Joma, who had a sinister face, came over and snatched him away, rolled him up in a reed mat, and carried him away. The dead child was struggling in the reeds, shouting, "Auntie, Auntie!" The child screamed louder and louder. Manson woke up in a cold sweat, and there was a snow-white morning light outside the window. Manson thought her dream was very strange. She didn't know that because she thought about the past and Shijin, she felt so empty and sad that she longed for her child even more. So she put together some fragments of impressions into such a dream. She couldn't sleep anymore and got up. She started everything early today. When she walked out of the door, it was not yet 7 o'clock. and there were still 2 hours before her office time. She was walking slowly on the road and suddenly decided to see her child. In fact, it was not so much a decision as it was that she suddenly discovered that she had always had this idea, so she came out very early, probably for this reason. We are almost arriving in Dan. From a distance, I saw a group of people walking out of the alley. 2 bearers were carrying a small coffin, followed by a maid. Wasn't that Joe's mother? Manzan's vision suddenly went dark. Her body was already leaning against the wall and she couldn't stand on her legs. She tried her best to calm down and look over there again. That week's mother held up a big banana fan with one hand to cover her head from the sun. Her mouth was moving. Probably she had just eaten breakfast and was sucking her teeth. This picture seemed particularly clear in Manzan's eyes, but she was a little confused in her heart. She felt like she was walking into a nightmare again. The coffin passed before her. She wanted to go up and ask Joe's mother who died, but Joe's mother didn't know who she was. While she was hesitating, they were already far away. When she changed her mind, she walked into Dianli without hesitation. She remembered that the Zhu family was the 4th home she entered. She went to ring the bell, and a maid came to open the door. The maid was an old man named Zhang. When the mother saw that it was Manzan, she couldn't help but froze for a moment and called out Miss Second. Manzan didn't say much to her, and just said, "How is the child?" Zhang's mother said, "It's better today." Obviously still alive, Manzan felt relieved and suddenly felt down to earth, but just like the elevator descending too fast, she felt dizzy instead. She stood holding the door frame for a while, then walked straight in and said, "Where is he? I'll go take a look." That Zhang mother thought that Manzan must have heard from elsewhere that the child was sick, so she came here after looking round. He led the way in front. It was a shikumen house with 1 floor and 1 floor. You could enter and exit from the back door, pass through the stove and mantle room, and come to the living room. The rows of doors in front of the living room were nailed shut. The room was dark and dark. There was a large bed in the back, and the child slept on that bed. Manzan saw that his face was red and he looked like he was sleeping, so he reached out and touched his forehead. It was so hot that it burned his hand. Just now Zhang Ma said that he was feeling better today, which turned out to be their usual social talk. Manzan whispered, "Did you ask a doctor to see him?" Zhang Ma said. "Yes, the doctor said it was his sister who had the disease and told them not to be in the same room." Manzan said, "Oh, it's an infection. Disease? Do you know what the disease is?" Zhang Ma said, "What is it called? Scarlet fever." Brother Zhao looked really uncomfortable afterwards. Poor. He died last night. Only then did Manzan realize that what she saw just now was Zhao, brother's coffin. She looked carefully at the child's face, but there were no red spots. However, I heard that scarlet fever sometimes does not show red spots on the skin. He tossed and turned on the bed, changing positions in less than a minute. It was uncomfortable no matter how he slept. Manzan held his hand. His hand was dry and hot, and her own hand felt as cold as ice. Zhang Ma brought tea in, and Manzan said, "Do you know if the doctor is coming today?" Zhang Ma said, "I didn't hear that. The master went out early this morning." After hearing this, Manzan couldn't help gritting his teeth. She really hated this talented man, who wanted to dominate the child and refused to let him go, and didn't take good care of him. She couldn't let her child lose his life in confusion like Zhaodi. She suddenly stood up and walked out, saying hastily to Zhang's mother, "I'll be back soon." She decided to invite Eugen over and ask him to see if it was scarlet fever. She always doubted whether the doctor hired by the Zhu family was reliable. At this time, Eugen probably hadn't gone out yet. It was still early. She jumped on a rickshaw and hurried back to her own apartment. She walked to the family's house diagonally across the street and rang the bell. However, Eugen had already seen her on the balcony. She was asking the servant at the door, "Is Dr. Zhang here? At home?" Eugen had already walked out and let her in with a smile. Manzan forced a smile and said, "I won't go in." "Are you okay now?" Seeing that she looked wrong, Eugen said, "What's wrong? Are you sick?" Manzan said, "It's not that I'm sick, because my sister's child is very sick. I'm afraid it's scarlet fever. I want you to go and have a look." Eugen said, Okay, I'll go right away. He went in and put on a coat, took his bag, and went with Manzin walking out together. The two took a rickshaw to Doanli. Eugen once heard that Manlu married very well. Her grandmother told him how she made a fortune and built a house on Hongqiao Road. He didn't expect that their family now lives in such a narrow house. He was very surprised. He thought he would see Manlu's husband. But the owner of the house did not show up, and there was only a maid serving as a receptionist. As soon as Eugen entered the living room, she saw Manlu's remains, framed and hanging in front of her. Manzin never saw her, but 2 times she came here. She was flustered and focused on the child. That big photo was probably taken 2 years before Manlu's death. Her eyes are squinting. Her chin is supported by one hand, and she wears a large, sparkling diamond ring on her hand. Eugen felt sad when he saw her irreconcilable charm and old attitude. He couldn't help but think of the last time they met. He might have been too cruel to her that time, and it still bothered him when he thought about it later. It was her child, so of course he was very concerned about it. He diagnosed it as scarlet fever. Manzin asked, "Do you want to go to the hospital?" Doctors always advocated going to the hospital, but seeing the Shu family in this state, Eugen seemed to be in a tight situation and had to make plans for them. So she said, "Hospitals are quite expensive now. As long as someone takes good care of her at home, it's the same." Manzin originally thought that if she went to the hospital, it would be more convenient for her to take care of her. But in fact she couldn't afford the money, and she couldn't expect Hongkai to come up with it. "It's okay not to go to the hospital." She asked Zhang Ma to find out that doctor's prescription and show it to Eugen. Eugen also thought that the prescription was correct. When Eugen left, Manzin sent him out all the way. He prepared some medicine at a pharmacy in Nongkou and brought it back. At the same time, he made a phone call from the pharmacy to where she worked and asked for half a day off. The child was more awake now and just looked at her with burning eyes. As soon as she turned her back, he quietly asked, "Zhang Ma, who is this?" Zhang Ma paused and said with a smile, "That's right. It's the second aunt." As he said this, he glanced at Manzin secretly. He looked up, as if he wasn't quite sure how she wanted her to answer. Manzin just shook the medicine bottle for a while, took a spoon and came over to ask the child to take the medicine, saying, "Take it quickly. It will be fine after you eat it." Then asked Zhang's mother, "What is his name?" Zhang mom said, "My name is Rongbao. This child is pitiful. My wife was very precious when she was alive. Now it's Zhoma who takes him." After saying this, she looked around and then said furtively, "Zhoma has no conscience. Although the master also loves the child, after all, it is a man's house. There are many things that he can't think of. The damn brother Zhao often beats her, although she doesn't dare to bully him openly. He also eats a lot of it secretly. It's her fault. Second miss, please don't tell others. She needs to know that if I tell you these things, I won't be able to make ends meet." Bao just had a falling out with her, so she took him away. Bao is not good either. After my wife died, many things were messed up in her hands. Mother Zhou didn't hold them at all, so she was so angry that she said bad things in front of the master. Zhang's mother brought out all the rights and wrongs of their family and told Manzin. She clearly thought that Manzin had not reconciled with Hongkai. When she came to Shu's house this time, and she would be the housewife here from now on. At this time, Zhou's mother went out if she hasn't come back yet. She should be sued immediately. Zhang Ma's view made Manzin feel very uncomfortable. She really didn't want to get involved in the Zhu family's affairs, but she couldn't express her position at the moment. Suddenly there was a knock on the back door, but Hongkai came back. Although Manzin was not unprepared at all, he could not help but feel a little uneasy. After all, this was his home. Zhang Ma went to open the door and immediately heard two people chattering in the kitchen, and then walked into the room one after another. It turned out that it was Zhou's mother who had sent the coffin of her younger brother to the cemetery for burial, and now she is back. Although Zhou's mother had never met Manzin, she had probably heard of someone like her, and she also knew that Rongbao was not their wife's biological child. Now that Manzin suddenly appeared, Zhoma couldn't help but be cautious. The second miss was longer than the second miss, and she was walking around to show her courtesy. Her murderous face was topped with a thick smile, but it was a bit chilling. Manson only treated her lightly, thinking that he could not offend her. She could still vent her resentment on the child. Zhou's mother felt guilty and was deeply afraid that Chang's mother would expose her crime in front of Manson. She had always bullied the sloppy old woman, but now she respected her as an old-timer and drove her to shout "Zhang Grandma." He took her to the kitchen to discuss what dishes to add to entertain the second young lady. Manson was there to remind herself that she should leave. Just tell Ma Zhang a few important things, and then leave. I'd rather come back in the afternoon. Just as he was thinking about it, Rong Bao spoke and asked, "Where's my sister?" This was the first time he spoke directly to Manson, but she couldn't answer what he said. After a while, Manson whispered, "Sister is asleep. Don't make trouble." Thinking of Zhoudi's death, a coldness hit her heart, and a primitive fear made her make a wish to herself. "As long as he gets better, I will never leave him forever." Although she knew this clearly, it's impossible. There was a hole in the mat that Rong Bao was sleeping on. He would dig it out irritably with his hands, and the hole would get bigger and bigger. Manson held both of his hands and whispered, "Don't do this." As she said that, a pair of tears fell on the mat with a thud in her eyes. Suddenly I heard Hong Sai's voice talking at the back door. As soon as I entered the door, I asked, "Has the doctor been here?" Zhang's mother said, "No, the second lady is here." After hearing this, Hong Kai suddenly became speechless. There was no sound for a long time, and Manson knew that he had been standing at the door of the living room for a long time. She sat there motionless, but the expression on her face became colder. She didn't look at him, but he finally staggered into her sight. He looked down and out. He didn't seem to have washed his face or shaved his beard. His thin face was covered with a layer of yellow-black oil. He was wearing an old silk gown with a yellowish-white color and a pair of trousers. An old straw hat with a yellowish-white inside. The hat is always on the head and never taken off. He walked up to the bed and touched Rong Bao's forehead, murmuring, "Is today better? Why hasn't the doctor come yet?" Manson said nothing. Hong Kai coughed and said, "Second sister, I feel relieved now that you are here. I am really anxious. I have encountered all kinds of bad luck in the past 2 years. My brother got sick, and I didn't." When she realized it was something bad, she quickly gave her an injection. She spent a lot of money, but it was too late. This child was born for her life, so she couldn't delay any longer. "I wanted to raise some money this morning. I just ran around all morning." At this point, he sighed and said, "I never imagined that we would end up like today." In fact, his failure in speculation was partly due to his superstitious belief in helping his husband's luck. Although he never admitted that his fortune was due to Manlu, he always believed that statement in his heart. It happened that when Manlu passed away, he had two things go wrong in succession, and he felt a little scared. Speculation is inherently a kind of gambling. The more you fear, the more you lose, so you end up completely defeated. And he believed even more firmly in the theory of helping one's husband. Joma twisted a handful of hot hand towels and brought them up to wipe Hong Sai's face. He took them absent-mindedly and just wiped his hands with them again and again. Zhou's mother walked away. After a while, he suddenly said, "Now that I think about it, I'm really sorry for her." He turned his back and looked at Manlu's photo, then put the towel on his face and blew his nose. He was clearly crying there. The sun was shining on Manlu's portrait, and the glass on the frame reflected a white light. The photo underneath was not visible at all, only a layer of dust on the glass was visible. Manson stared blankly at the photo. Her sister was dead, and she herself had been disheartened in the past few years. All the entangled grievances in the past seemed to have turned into smoke. Hong Kai added, "I feel sorry for her when I think about it. She was so sick at that time, and I still made her angry, otherwise she might not have died. Second sister, everything in the past was all my fault. Don't hate me, you're my sister." He felt sorry for himself because he was worried about money. Manson didn't expect this. Seeing him blaming himself like this, she felt that he was not completely heartless. After all, she is not deeply involved in the world. She doesn't know that the more cruel people are, the more cowardly they are. The more lawless people are when they are proud, the less they can withstand a little setback. And they immediately become shorter, showing a pitiful face. She actually felt a trace of pity for Hong Kai amid her hatred. Although she still didn't intend to ignore him, she didn't want to embarrass him too much. Hong Kai glanced at her face and murmured, "Second sister, if you don't look at anything else, this child is pitiful. You can take care of him here for a few days, and then go back when he gets better. I'm going to stay at a friend's house, a few days." He was afraid that she was going to refuse, so he walked out of the room before he finished speaking, took out a wad of banknotes from his pocket, stuffed it into Zhang's mother's hand, and said, "You can give it to the second lady later. The doctor is here and asks her to pay." He then said, "I'm either at Wang's house or at Mr. Yan's. If anything happens, just call me." After that, he hurried away as if running away. Manson actually believed that he probably kept his word this time and wouldn't come back if he didn't come back. Manlo had told her over and over again that Hong Kai had always respected and loved her very much. He always thought that she was different from any other woman. He only committed crimes when he was temporarily delirious because he loved her so much. For the sake of, words like this are easy for a woman to believe, and I'm afraid no woman is an exception. Although Manson had no reaction at the time, Manlu's words were not in vain after all. She stayed at Ju's house that night and didn't go back. She stayed with the child and didn't sleep all night. She had to go to work as usual the next morning and returned to Ju's house. After get off work, knowing that Hong Kai had already come once and left again. At this time, Manson felt much more at ease. At least she could take care of her child's illness without worrying about Hong Kai. She was originally going to invite Eugen to come again, but she suddenly remembered that Eugen must be very busy these 2 days. Didn't his wife go to the hospital yesterday? She would have an operation in the next 2 days. She was so anxious yesterday that she completely forgot about this matter. In fact, you don't need to see Eugen anymore. Just go to the original doctor and continue seeing him. Eugen felt a sense of responsibility for the child's illness. That night, he went to Manson's apartment again to ask her if the child was feeling better. The second landlord told him Manson never came back. Eugen also knew that they had another doctor treating them there. Since Manson was there to take charge of everything, there must be nothing wrong with them, so he put the matter aside. Eugen was staying at his father-in-law's house. Their window was facing Manson's window, and Eugen often couldn't help but glance over there. In such a hot weather, the 2 windows were always closed, so no one must be at home. Through the glass window, you can see 2 towels drying inside, a pink one hanging on the back of the chair, and a white one hanging on the rope. They will always be in this position. The yellow sun was shining from morning to night, and the 2 towels were bound to get rotten. After being exposed to the sun for more than 10 days, the towel was baked into just stiff pieces, and the color became much lighter. Manson has been staying at Ju's house and has not come back. Eugen is not surprised, thinking that her sister died and left such a child with no one to take care of her. His father may be an uneducated person, and maybe he has been thinking about it all day long. Manson has always been the most enthusiastic and responsible person when she has to run around for food and clothing. And she has always been the most enthusiastic and responsible when the child is sick. She is of course obliged to take care of him. But time passed day by day. After Eugen's wife had an operation and gave birth to a girl, she rested in the hospital for a period of time. The couple was ready to leave for Luen, but Manson had not returned yet. Eugen originally wanted to go to her brother-in-law's house to say goodbye to her, but after all, it was a house she didn't know very well, and it didn't seem good to run there rashly, so she kept putting it off and didn't go. On this day, he suddenly saw an open window on the Manson's side, and the 2 towels had changed their positions, as if they had been newly washed and hung up again. He thought she must be back. He immediately went downstairs and went to the opposite door to find her. He had been here twice, and the second landlord already knew him, so he let him go upstairs without stopping him. Manson was sweeping the floor and wiping the table there. She hadn't been home these days, and the dust had accumulated thickly. Eugen knocked twice on the open door with a smile. Manzin looked up and saw him. At the first moment, a shadow seemed to pass over her face. It seemed that she didn't want him to come, but Yujin thought this was probably an illusion on his part. He walked in and said with a smile, "I haven't seen you for a long time. Is the child okay?" Manzin smiled and said, "Okay, I didn't come to say congratulations to you. Your wife has been discharged from the hospital now, right? Is it a boy or a girl? A child?" Yujin smiled and said, "It's a girl. Rongshan has been out for a week, and we plan to go back tomorrow." Manzin let out a sound and said, "Are you about to leave?" She put a rag on the chair. He wiped it off and asked Yujin to sit down. Yujin sat down and said with a smile, "I'm leaving tomorrow, and I don't know when I'll see you next time. So I'm going to come see you today anyway and talk to you more. He must talk to you again before leaving." She met him once because she had said last time that she had a lot to tell him, and her tone sounded like there was some hidden pain. But at this time, Manzin regretted what she said to him. Now that she has decided to marry Hong Kai, there is no need to mention those things in the past. The table had been wiped clean, and she wiped it unconsciously with a rag. After wiping for a long time, I leaned against the window and shook off the dust on the rag. It was originally a shabby pink turban, but she used it to make a rag. He held it with 2 hands and shook it out of the window. The red gauze floated lazily in the sunset and breeze. The weather was very nice in the afternoon. Yujin waited for a while, but when she didn't say anything, she smiled and said, "Didn't you say you had a lot of things to tell me last time?" Manzin said, "Yes, but when I thought about it later, I didn't want to mention those things again." "Yeah." Yujin thought she was afraid that mentioning it would cause sadness in vain. So he paused and said, "Maybe it would be more satisfying to talk about it." Manzin remained silent. Yujin was silent for a while and then said, "I came here this time because I felt that your mood was not very good. It was very different from before." Although he said it in such an understatement, he said it with emotion. Tone, Manzin shivered unconsciously. As soon as he saw her, he could tell that she was suffering from menstrual stimulation and that her whole person was completely broken. She always thought she at least looked calm on the outside. She looked at Yujin and said with a smile, "Do you think I have completely changed as a person?" Yujin hesitated for a moment and then said, "My appearance has not changed, but I always feel." In the past, he always thought that she was the most talented person. Vibrant, her personality also has its resolute side. People of all ages depend on her for their lives. She seems to be brave and retains a quiet demeanor. During this meeting, she looked so desolate and a little dazed. Just the oppression of life will never make her become this powerful. He believed that it was because of Shen Shijin. I don't know what happened in the middle, which prevented them from starting and finishing. Since she didn't want to say anything, Yujin certainly couldn't ask her. He could only say to her sincerely, "I'm not here. Can you always write to me tomorrow? To be honest, I feel a little worried when you see you like this." The more concerned he became, the more man instead. Zhen felt a burst of sadness. He couldn't stop himself anymore and burst into tears. Yujin looked at her and was stunned. After a long while, she smiled and said, "It's all my fault. Don't talk about it." Manzin suddenly blurted out, "No, I want to tell you at this point." I choked again. She really didn't know where to start. Seeing Yujin listening so intently, her mind suddenly became confused, and she blurted out, "The child you saw is not my sister's." Yujin looked at her in shock, and she turned her face away. But there was a cold and tough look on his face. Yujin thought, is that child hers? Is it her illegitimate child and was given to her sister to raise? Is it Shen Shijin's child? Or is it someone else's? Is this the reason why Shijin left her? A series of speculations, all of which he could not believe, were all passing through his mind at this moment. But Manzin started talking intermittently again. This time she started talking from the day when Yujin came to her home to deliver the wedding invitation. On that day, she accompanied her mother to visit her sister's home. In the middle of the narration, she always wanted to leave some room for her sister, because Yujin's relationship with Manlu was so deep in the past, and she was unwilling to destroy the remaining feelings he had for Manlu. Besides, her sister is dead now. But no matter how she tried to excuse Manlu, she was imprisoned in Ju's house for a year, and Manlu always sat idly by and did nothing. This was always the truth. Eugen was simply shocked. He couldn't imagine how Manlu could participate in such a despicable conspiracy. He didn't know Manlu's husband at all, and he might be a man who did all kinds of evil. But Manlu, he remembered the scene when they first met when they were 15 or 16 years old, and when they were first engaged, and later, she fought for the family. When I went out to be a dancer, I said goodbye to him. He knew she was such a pure and kind person. Even the last time he saw her, he felt that she had become vulgar, but that was not her fault. He believed that her essence was still good. Why is she so heartless towards her own sister? Manzin continued to talk, saying that she managed to escape after giving birth. Her mother tried to find out her whereabouts, but persuaded her to return to Ju's house. Eugen felt that her mother was so ridiculous that he was so angry that he could not speak. Manzin also said that when her sister was seriously ill, she personally begged her to marry Hong Kai for the sake of the child, but she refused again. When she said this, her tone couldn't help but become dull and low. Because even though she refused at the time, she still wanted to do the deceased's wish now. She also knew that this was wrong, and she felt extremely conflicted, and needed to discuss it with Eugen, but she really didn't have the courage to speak out. She felt very sorry in her heart, especially towards Eugen. Just now, she tried her best to reduce her sister's responsibility because she was caring for Eugen's feelings, which inadvertently aggravated Hong Sai's crime and made him look like a devil. At this time, she suddenly turned around and said she wanted to marry him. Of course, it is even more unspeakable. In fact, she also knew that even if she described him better and made him a more or less passive character, Eugen would still not agree. This kind of marriage where one makes mistakes would probably be disapproved of by any friend who sincerely cares for her. She spoke of her sister's death and said no more. Eugen sat there with her arms folded and her eyes lowered, never speaking. He really didn't know what words to use to comfort her. But her story was not over yet. Eugen suddenly remembered that this time her child was sick and she went to take care of him. After living at Ju's house for so many days, there must have been a considerable understanding between her and Hong Kai. Otherwise, how could she live there and for such a long time? Could it be that she has changed her original intention and is ready to sacrifice herself for the happiness of her child and marry Hong Kai? He even suspected that she was already living with Hong Kai. No, that's not the case. She is definitely not that kind of person. He underestimates her too much. He thought about it for a long time and finally said cautiously, "I think your attitude is right. Your sister's request is simply unreasonable. Isn't this kind of forced union ruining a lifetime?" He also advised he told her many words, and she had never heard Eugen say such words in one breath. He believes that if a couple lives together, if one person feels pain, the other person cannot be happy. In fact, there was no need for him to say anything. She had thought of everything he could say, perhaps even more thoroughly. For example, if Hong Kai treats her, even if he really loves her, for a person like him, can his love last forever? But we can't say that. At first she believed that Shijin really loved her and that his love should be lasting, but it turned out not to be the case. So now she has no definite belief in anything in the world, and feels that everything is futile. But her children were the only real thing. Especially this time she snatched him back at the critical moment of life and death. She couldn't leave him alone anymore. She herself was of no importance, and it did not seem to matter much what she did with herself. For example, she is dead. Eugen said again, "Actually, as long as you make up your mind now, your future will be bright." He was just a word of encouragement. After listening to it, Manzin felt sad in her heart and tears were about to flow down again. What's the point of crying to him all the time? Eugen's current environment is also different. In this situation, she should be a little more measured. She stood up abruptly and said with a smile, "Look at me. I've been talking nonsense for a long time, but I still won't pour you a cup of tea." There were 2 glasses on the chest of drawers, and she picked up one. I took a photo of it in the bright light. but after not using it for a long time, a lot of dust fell on it. Here she was busy wiping the teacup and looking for tea leaves, but Eugen was stunned. Why did she suddenly become so polite? It seemed that she didn't want to talk anymore. However, when he thought about it again, his words of advice were just empty words of comfort, and he was really helpless to her. He was silent for a while and then said, "You don't have to pour the tea, I'm leaving." Manzin didn't stop him. She picked up another glass, blew the dust off, and wiped it with a rag. Eugen stood up to leave, took out a notepad from his pocket, tore off a piece of paper, bent down on the table, wrote his own address, and handed it to Manzin. Manzin said, "I have your address." Eugen said, "Is it the 14th here?" He also wrote it on his notepad. Manzin thought that she would take back the house here, and he would not be able to send a letter, but she did not say anything. She really couldn't tell him. In the future, he would always hear from others that she was married to Hong Kai. He must be thinking about why she is so worthless, and he must regret that he valued her too much in the past. She sent him downstairs and asked before leaving, "When will you leave tomorrow?" Eugen said, "You will leave early tomorrow morning." Manzin came back upstairs and stood at the window. She saw Eugen still standing at the back door diagonally opposite. It seemed that no one had opened the door after ringing the bell. He saw her too, smiled, and raised one hand in something close to a wave. Manzin also smiled and nodded, and then quickly stepped back because tears were streaming down her face. She stood in front of the table and sobbed, and picked up the rag to wipe her eyes. When she realized it was a rag, she threw it on the table again. The old red gauze slid lazily from the table to the floor.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.